Please Hold by Kieran O'Driscoll is undoubtedly a prescient poem. That means it's a poem which seems able to predict the future in quite an uncanny way. On the surface, written in 2008, it deals with a man's frustration at the rise in technology. So when trying to telephone his bank, he can't talk to a human and he's talking to a robot operative who gets him stuck in a kind of feedback loop. But the poem is also, and this comes directly from the poet, about his anxiety about capitalist ways of living and working. And only a couple of years after the poem, which mentions looting at the end, in 2011, there was widespread rioting and looting and civil unrest, triggered originally by the arguably arrest of an arguably unarmed man, but really became a wider scale protest about the separation between rich and poor in the UK. Furthermore, I don't think any poem in the collection could be as relevant to now as this one is, because if you think about all of the debate around the rise of AI, artificial intelligence, and how that might affect us both positively and negatively, and how fearful we are of it, rightly so, in my opinion, this poem seems to have predicted all of that as well, even though it was written 15 years ago. So, the poem, again, like many of the poems in the collection, doesn't necessarily have those traditional language features, such as figurative language, that you might be looking for. And we're always going to need to relate the features that we do find to an argument that we have. And I think this poem is likely to be paired with something to do with identity, or humanity, human nature, and the difference between human and synthetic human, quite possibly. And there are a lot of poems around that topic, but certainly something to do with identity, possibly something to do with technology or even anger. So what we need to do, rather than looking for those language features, that figurative language, is think about why they are absent and how that feeds into meaning. And the lack of figurative language, the lack of similes and metaphors, perhaps emphasises the cold, hard reality of living in the world that we live in. You know, if you are poor, if you are disenfranchised from society, if you do feel that you lack control, there's no point dressing that up in pretty similes or metaphors or comparisons. It's real and it's tough. So that harshness is mirrored in the lack of figurative language. The poem, however, does have features in it that are worth commenting on, and a number of the most prominent features are structural features. So, for example, you've got a really clear, discernible poetic voice, haven't you? Which appears to almost be autobiographical from the poet himself. And he does say that he wrote this poem in anger. So it's almost as if he's speaking to us about this experience of this phone call and his thoughts about capitalism. But there are also three individuals in the poem. There's the poet, there's his wife, and then there's the robot that he's speaking to. And quite an interesting exercise, I think, with the poem is to highlight who's saying what. So if you do the poet in one colour, the wife in another, and the robot in a third, I won't do that for you because it will make my poem look really confusing for you here. But it's quite interesting to see the way that the poet's got balance between the three, who he thinks is in control of the world. Because he is the voice of the rebel, he is the voice of the protester. And again, if we think about the poem being prescient, and we think about the recent pandemic, those people who protested at first against the way the government was dealing with the pandemic, those people who protested against vaccines were really seen as outliers. And now there's a little bit more sympathy for not necessarily what they believed in. I'm certainly not trying to be an anti-vaxxer by any means, but for their right to protest and their duty, our citizens' duty to question things. So that represents the poet. Secondly, the wife represents the kind of compliant majority. This is the future. We are already there. She says, this is how things are. This is how things should be. It's the same as the present. And the robot, of course, is the thing that they are rebelling against or complying with. So it's like a microcosm, a little miniature version of a democratic society, in which people are allowed some agency over what happens, but that doesn't always go terribly well for them. You'll notice patterns throughout the poem, and remember that with poetry, one of the most useful things to be doing is looking for patterns. First of all, you've got this one long, if I just lift the camera up so you can see, one long stanza, which is all like a stream of consciousness, which expresses the poet's frustration. So you've got one long stanza and it's written in free verse. So it really is like he's just talking to you or shouting out his feelings, most of which are kind of angry and negative. And you've got repeated phrases and words all the way through the poem, haven't you? So words like money, great, robot, but then you've also got anaphora, repeated phrases such as this is the future. And notice how he uses capital letters to really emphasize things, even when they're not at the start of the sentence. So it gives them a sense of significance, as if he feels small compared to what the robot is saying and what his wife is saying. You've got a lot of end stops here as well at the lines. So it's like the narrative voice is asking for things to get done, but he keeps getting stopped or keeps getting prevented from doing it. So as well as the mechanistic responses created by the anaphora, I'll just write that down for you. So the responses from the robot are mechanistic, like a machine. You've also got this kind of stop-start rhythm with the end stops, which suggests frustration. When I give him my telephone number, and great, says the robot when I give him my account number. Notice how quickly the poetic voice goes from calling him a robot to the robot to him. So there's a shift there in the poetic voice's attitude to the robot, as if he gradually starts to credit the robot with more significance, even with a sense of humanity. And right at the beginning of the poem, we've got this paradox. This is the future, we are already there, and it's the same as the present. Straight away the poem opens with this paradox, which makes us question reality. Where are we? What's happening? And what things are possible? And countless sci-fi films and books have dealt with the idea of what would happen if robots took over in the future. Would they become aggressive if they noticed anything paradoxical going on? Because a lot of human behaviour and instinct is paradoxical and illogical, particularly to a robot brain, I'm sure. You've got the juxtaposition of the way he uses adjectives as well. So using words like wonderful to describe a telephone number and a great account number. There's nothing wonderful or great about a telephone number or an account number. They don't have emotion attached to them, do they? So I don't really see how you can suggest that. And again, that serves to back up the robot's frustration. As we move further through the poem, the repetition of money, my money, juxtaposed with to pay for nothing. You've got repetition and contrast there, which really does emphasise that the poem is to do with capitalism, not just to do with freedom. And one of the concerns that the poetic voice has is who is looking after his money and whether that's safe or whether they're corrupt. The robot here gives him options, none of which are viable. So again, sense of frustration, and in terms of language, a sense of paradox. Here, the tone changes. I scream, agent. So we get a shift in tone where the narrative voice is becoming increasingly angry. But then when the wife speaks, she's still saying the same thing. And we could call that a mantra. So a mantra is a chant with repeated phrases, often associated with religions like Buddhism. And mantras are meant to be kind of calming and affirming, but actually this mantra serves only to irritate him further. Then the tone increases in terms of his frustration. I'm talking to a robot on the phone and he's given me no options in the guise of countless alternatives. So again, you've got that juxtaposition there to express that I'm being told I can do anything I want, but actually I can't do anything because I can't talk to a human. Then we've got him being put on hold, which echoes the title of the poem, please hold, please hold, please hold. And that's repeated so many times, it has to have significance, doesn't it? So the literal meaning, of course, is pausing a phone call while the person that you're speaking to perhaps transfers you to someone else or goes to find someone else to help them. But the inferred meaning there is perhaps humanity is clinging on, just about holding on to security before the future changes. And there's almost a mocking tone of the robot telling him to keep hold of things. And in fact, it explains it for us here. Please hold means that for all your accomplishments, the only way you can now meet your needs is by looting. So looting means kind of robbing things from a shop, which might be unattended, like a mass scale burglary. And this sense that you can't hold on anymore, you can't keep hold of your possessions, you can't keep hold of your sanity, you can't keep hold of your control in any way because of what's happening in the modern world. Then we get the expletive here, the swear word, which is an expression of how frustrated the narrative voice is becoming. And then the robot transfers me to himself. Now, the hold music that he's being played is very, very common hold music, Eine kleine Nacht music, which actually means a little night music, most people will tell you, but really infers that the music is a serenade. Now, a serenade is a piece of music that you play to someone, kind of in tribute to them. And there's an irony there because the poetic voice doesn't feel special. He doesn't feel as if he's being celebrated anyway. He feels really insignificant whilst the robot plays him this serenading music. And again, the wife repeats her mantra. Lastly, we get this strange little tercet at the end after the robot acknowledges that looting will be necessary now. So we get this almost sense of dystopian deterioration, not quite sure what's happened in the world outside, but the poetic voice now thinks that he's got to loot in order to have any money. And then we get this little tercet at the end, which rhymes throughout, so that's a shift in tone, isn't it? Please hold, please grow old. And you've got this repeated word please, this modifier, which suggests desperation at this point. And it's not clear whether the robot is saying this to the poetic voice or the poetic voice is saying it to us, the reader, begging us, pleading with us to hold on, but also to grow old naturally to grow cold? Should we switch off our emotions and not mind because there's nothing we can do about this terrible dystopian future? Should we comply, do what we're told? Then he reduces that. Grow old, grow cold. This is the future. Please hold. And there's a sense at the end of there's nothing we can do. There's a real sense of this is inevitable, this terrible future in which the world will be run by computers and humans will have no control. So, altogether, it's a stream of consciousness in which the poet lets us listen to a conversation that he's having with a robot, but really he's just expressing his frustration at modernity, at capitalism, and possibly at technology as well. So I think the poem would be interesting to be paired with anything to do with change, identity, or even things to do with technology.